Rome once declared war on the ocean, not metaphorically and not in a poetic sense, but because the Roman state genuinely believed that the sea had behaved improperly and needed to be dealt with. This was not a joke to them, although it absolutely is to us, and the fact that Rome treated this as a reasonable response tells you almost everything you need to know about how Roman power actually worked. Rome, at its core, was a land empire that happened to sit next to a very inconvenient body of water. The Roman military was built for marching, digging, stabbing, and refusing to retreat, and it performed these tasks with relentless efficiency. The sea, however, did not respond well to discipline, hierarchy, or aggressive confidence, which immediately made it suspicious in Roman eyes. In the 3rd century BCE, Rome was still climbing toward empire rather than comfortably ruling one, and the Mediterranean already belonged to someone else. Carthage was a naval superpower, with centuries of maritime experience, deep pockets, and sailors who treated the sea as a workplace rather than an enemy. Rome treated ships as temporary mistakes that happened between land battles. When conflict erupted between Rome and Carthage in the First Punic War, Rome quickly discovered that no amount of legions could solve a problem that required boats. Carthage could resupply armies, move forces, and avoid direct confrontation simply by using the water, which Rome had previously hoped to ignore. Rome's response was not caution, humility, or learning from experts, because Rome never did any of those things. Instead, Rome built a navy very quickly and with enormous confidence, despite having almost no experience sailing it. According to ancient sources, Roman engineers captured a Carthaginian ship, copied it plank by plank, and then added a boarding bridge called the Corvus, which allowed Roman soldiers to storm enemy ships and turn naval battles into awkward floating land fights. This actually worked, at least at first, which immediately convinced Rome that it had mastered the sea and that the ocean was now subject to Roman innovation. Unfortunately, the Corvus made ships unstable in rough water, and the Mediterranean has never cared about anyone's engineering confidence. In 249 BCE, Rome placed its faith in a consul named Publius Claudius Pulcher, a man whose name alone suggests aristocratic self-assurance. Pulcher was sent to command a fleet against the Carthaginians near the port of Drepana, and like all good Roman officials, he began by consulting the gods through sacred chickens. These chickens were not symbolic mascots, but active participants in Roman decision-making, because Roman religion believed that the gods communicated through signs, and refusing to read those signs was not bravery, but stupidity. If the chickens ate eagerly, the gods approved, and if they refused, the message was very clear. On that morning, the chickens refused to eat. Pulcher, rather than reconsidering his plans, decided that the gods were being uncooperative and responded by throwing the chickens into the sea, declaring that if they would not eat, they could drink instead. This was meant to be dismissive humor, but it also perfectly captured the Roman belief that ritual existed to serve authority, not restrain it. The gods, if they were listening, were not impressed. The battle that followed was a disaster on a scale that would have been impressive if it had not been so humiliating. The Carthaginian fleet maneuvered smoothly and efficiently, while Roman ships struggled to turn, collided with one another, and failed to deploy their boarding bridges effectively. Dozens of Roman ships were sunk or captured, thousands of men were killed or taken prisoner, and Pulcher returned to Rome with his reputation in pieces. He was tried, fined, and publicly shamed, not just for losing the battle, but for offending the gods, which suggests that Rome was willing to forgive incompetence more readily than disrespect toward divine bureaucracy. Pulcher disappeared from public life, and his name became a warning rather than a legacy. Rome, however, did not take the hint. Instead of questioning whether it understood the sea at all, Rome decided that the loss must have been a fluke, and immediately assembled another enormous fleet. This time, there was no enemy to fight, because nature itself stepped in to finish the job. As the Roman ships sailed along the southern Italian coast, a massive storm struck, smashing vessels against rocks, capsizing ships weighed down by heavy equipment, and drowning tens of thousands of soldiers. Ancient estimates suggest that nearly 100 ships were destroyed and that as many as 90,000 men died, not in glorious combat, but because the ocean had strong opinions about Roman optimism. This was one of the worst naval disasters in ancient history, and it occurred without Carthage lifting a finger. Rome had been defeated by the sea itself. The Roman response to this catastrophe was not to acknowledge environmental limits or revise strategy, because that would have implied that something existed beyond Roman control. Instead, Roman culture interpreted disasters as moral or ritual failures, meaning that someone had angered the gods or allowed disorder to exist. If disorder existed, it had to be punished. Roman sources suggest that symbolic acts were ordered to assert dominance over the sea, effectively treating it as a rebellious entity rather than an indifferent force. This logic sounds absurd now, but it made sense within a worldview where authority was expected to function everywhere, from Senate chambers to battlefields to the natural world itself. This unresolved hostility toward the ocean reached its most theatrical expression decades later under the Emperor Caligula, a man who treated symbolism like a performance art medium. During a northern campaign, Caligula lined his soldiers up along the coast, ordered them to attack the waves with spears, and commanded them to collect seashells as spoils of war, declaring victory over Neptune, the god of the sea. To modern audiences, this looks like madness. To Romans, it looked like power being displayed loudly enough that no one could ignore it. Caligula understood that Roman authority thrived on spectacle, and if the sea could not be conquered physically, it could at least be humiliated symbolically. The act was ridiculous, but it followed the same logic that had driven Rome for centuries. Dominance must always be demonstrated, even when it makes no practical sense. Rome eventually won the First Punic War, not because it became a great naval power, but because it refused to stop rebuilding fleets until Carthage collapsed under financial strain. Rome outlasted the sea rather than mastering it, which became its standard approach to most problems. Even at the height of empire, Rome feared the ocean. Grain fleets that fed the city were constantly at risk, storms threatened supply lines, and emperors understood that calm seas mattered more than military victories. A delayed shipment could mean riots, starvation, or political disaster. And yet, Rome never stopped pretending it was in control. That is why the story of Rome declaring war on the ocean is more than a funny anecdote about superstition and arrogance. It reveals how empires think, how they respond to chaos, and how easily confidence turns into denial. Rome could conquer land, command armies, and impose law on millions of people, but it could not command the weather, the tides, or the basic reality that some forces do not respond to authority. The sea did not care about Roman rituals, titles, or confidence, and it never adjusted its behavior accordingly. Rome punished it anyway. In the end, Rome survived the sea not by defeating it, but by constantly negotiating with it through prayer, ritual, and sheer stubborn persistence. The ocean remained dangerous, unpredictable, and completely unimpressed by Roman power, which may be the most honest relationship Rome ever had. The land could be conquered, people could be ruled, and institutions could be bent, but the sea remained exactly what it had always been, which is why Rome never truly won its war against it, no matter how many shells it collected or chickens it drowned. Netflix would absolutely describe this as a metaphor and move on without explanation.